world is roiled these days by the intersection of politics and markets, and we have brought together for you some of the world's greatest experts on these subjects to talk about them and illuminate all their contours and educate all of us. I have a teenage daughter, and I was trying to teach her cultural history, and I was showing her Annie Hall the other night, and the wonderful scene in which he's online at a movie, and this guy is behind him pontificating and talking about Marshall McLuhan, and he brings out, he says, "You don't know what you're talking about." He says, "Of course I do, I teach this stuff," and he goes off screen and he pulls in Marshall McLuhan, and he says, and Marshall McLuhan says, "You don't know what you're talking about. I'm not sure how they let you teach this stuff. This is ridiculous." And Woody Allen turns to the camera and says, "Wouldn't it be great if life were like that?" Well, tonight I am happy to tell you that life is like that. We may not have Marshall McLuhan risen from the grave, but we have a group of expert panelists who actually know what they're talking about. And unlike all the other people who jabber away, blah, 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 these are people who actually can help us understand what's going on. Melissa Carney is an extraordinarily impressive economist. She is a professor at the University of Maryland. Her entire academic resume is in your materials, and I would advise you to study it. Michael Kazin is a distinguished historian, a longtime fixture at Dissent magazine and one of the major progressive forces in the progressive movement on policy issues, and a wonderful commentator in general. And Nick Johnston is running, what is in many respects one of the best examples of what information technology can be when it's done right, which is using technology to convey information accurately and succinctly and intelligently, and making us smarter rather than dumber, which all the rest of the information technology revolution seems to be aimed at doing. So we have a great panel for you tonight. And let me just set it up by saying the following. We're in a town right now that is ridden by competing narratives of what's going on elsewhere in politics. It's true of what's going on in what you might call the populist movement, the neo-socialist movement as well. Most of the people in this room are familiar with a kind of Schumpeterian narrative of what's happened over the last couple of generations. Brilliant entrepreneurs have organized, created interesting economic activity, have given great benefits to humanity. As a result of this, they have made great fortunes. Everybody else has benefited from the technologies and the innovations that they have generated, and we're all basically in the debt of the wonderful Silicon Valley giant gods who have essentially given us the wonders of modern life. And we should celebrate them and thank them, and the amount that they get and the control and power that they have is only their natural due for the benefits that they have given humanity. Okay, a lot of truth to this narrative, and it's one that we all are basically familiar with. There is a competing narrative, and it may be one that some people in this room are not quite as familiar with. It's basically a progressive narrative, and the easiest way to think about it is in terms of Wagner's Ring. Wagner had a kind of anti-capitalist component to the ring cycle, and George Bernard Shaw wrote a wonderful book about the ring cycle, explaining that it was really a didactic socialist text, because what its basic story was there was this wonderful gold in nature. Nature had riches. And then somebody came along and stole it. And then some other people came along, a bunch of rich people who thought they were gods, came along and stole it from them, and used it to put a down payment on a really great mansion, taking on a lot of debt in the process, but building a giant mansion in the sky called Valhalla. And that's the end of Rheingold. That's just right there, I told you, is the story of Das Rheingold. Then there are basically two operas, Valkyrie, Siegfried, that talk about the various schemes of the people who were dispossessed to get the gold back. And then the final opera, Götterdämmerung, is a tragedy in which the bill for the giant McMansion in the sky comes due. Ultimately, the gold is returned, the exploitation is eliminated, and the old order is removed. And then a bunch of humans step on the stage. That is the leftist narrative of what has been playing out. It's the exact opposite of the Silicon Valley narrative. You think of it as the Marxist and Shavian one rather than the Schumpeterian and Smithian one. So we're going to basically run through that for you and explain what that means and how that actually works. Melissa is one of the world's experts on economic inequality, and we'll talk about the predicate of what's going on. Michael is one of the world's experts on populism, and is going to tell us how that merges, the economic anxiety merges into what we've seen politically. And Nick is one of the great journalists of the day talking about covering what's actually happening with the populist challenge and with the neo-socialist challenge on the left side. So with that, let's get into it. Melissa, what is the rise in economic inequality that has occurred over the last couple of generations that has driven so much angst?
That is a more flowery narrative than I'm used to as an empirical economist, so I will do my best to roll with it. So I'm going to start by saying I do think the rise in income inequality in the country, which is really irrefutable, is a problem, but not because I'm in any way anti-capitalist, and not because in any way do I think that the folks who have benefited tremendously from various global secular trends have done something nefarious or even unfair. Okay, so I don't subscribe to either of those sort of benchmarking cases, and I don't think that we need to address income inequality to punish the people at the top who've done extraordinarily well. But that said, income inequality has been rising, and there's nothing in the data to suggest that the trends we've been experiencing for the past 40 years are going to reverse themselves anytime soon. My read of the evidence is that what's been driving income inequality is largely global secular trends that have really benefited the highly skilled, right? In particular, the highly educated, the creative class. Now, I do think we've had a failure to respond at a policy level that has sort of left some of those trends unabated. But I don't blame policy in particular. So all of that I think is true. I think everyone's seen the numbers. We know that the top has just really taken off in the past 40 years. The very top, like the top 1%, the top 0.01%, has seen their incomes double, triple, quadruple, while those in the bottom have seen, depending on, people quibble about the numbers, but have seen 0 to maybe a 10% increase in their market income. So that is just, that's really irrefutable. I think there's 4 elements to it, and I'll run through them quickly. The first is that, one way really to think about what's happening is that there's a huge education gap now, and that I worry about a lot. So the folks without college degrees are really just being hammered by a confluence of trends, and we haven't done enough to help those folks without a college degree. A second issue is that there are parts of the country that have really also been hammered, and we haven't done enough to address the growing economic divergence. And in the past, much like we could rely on a rising tide to lift all boats for all individuals, and everyone's income went up sort of proportionately over time, that's fallen apart at both an individual level and at a place level. We're not seeing the convergence in economic outcomes across places that we used to. So there really are a lot of non-metro regions, a lot of parts of the eastern central part of the U.S. in particular that are in this sort of perpetual economic malaise. And the third thing that I think is really troubling, and this will sort of feed into, I hope what the other 2 panelists will talk about, is this vast level of income inequality that's been persistent now for 40 years has really eroded any sense of equal opportunity in the U.S. People are living in different neighborhoods, different schools, different cultural spheres entirely, and it's really sort of translated into an erosion in actual economic mobility and the belief in economic mobility. And our whole capitalist system and democratic system doesn't really work if people believe that the system is rigged and that there's no way for them to get ahead. And so sort of the trends that have driven income inequality, that have left a lot of people behind, not only in a relative sense, but in an absolute sense, have just sort of eroded our shared institutional, cultural, educational experience, and I'm really worried that we're going to be in sort of perpetual class differences, intergenerational transmission of classes in a way that just that will really change the way America works.
Wow, that's a really cheery open. Thank you, Melissa. Michael, how does economics translate into politics?
Let me go back a little bit first. Everybody hear me? Populism is an American term. I don't know if everyone knows that. It sounds like Latin. In fact, it was coined by a journalist in Kansas who asked the People's Party of Kansas back in 1890, well, you can't call yourself the People'sist Party, or the Peoplearian Party. What are you going to call it? And someone knew some Latin said, oh, populist, and that's how the term got its name. And now it's taken off to many different languages. But it's not a new phenomenon, obviously, since we're talking about the 1890s. And but it does arise and become a more dominant phenomenon during economic crises, or when felt economic crises. And it's almost always mixed, as it is now, with ethnic anxieties, religious anxieties, cultural anxieties. And for that reason, there's not one kind of populism. There are several. This is a book I wrote in 1995, and a new edition of it, which shows this guy in the top, in silhouette, Bernie Sanders, this guy in the bottom, President Trump, both of whom use analogous kinds of language, talking about the moral people who are being ripped off by the elites, but they have very different definitions of who the people are and who the elites are. And that has been true for a long, long time. For example, in the 1960s, there were people on the left, like me, who talked a language of, the economic elites, the liberal elites, driving America into the war in Vietnam, not doing enough to get Americans out of poverty. Corporate liberalism was a term we used. But then there was George Wallace. For those of you old enough to remember George Wallace, not a name I like to, remember fondly, of course. But George Wallace talked about how the two major parties, there was not a dime with the difference between them, and he thought it'd be good to have a steelworker with a 10th grade education in the White House. So his definition of people was angry, free from racism, whereas the definition that I and my comrades had was much closer to socialism. So I think what's happening now, and Melissa, I think, gave a wonderful presentation of the issues people are responding to, is that people are responding in different ways, and they can talk about, politically how that plays out. But clearly, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump use similar kinds of language to mean very different things. Then we're in a sort of populist universe. I like to think that there's sort of two kinds of populism, at least in American history, with some parallels to what's going on in Europe now as well. One kind of populism, which has been much more typical on the left, is Bernie Sanders kind of populism, which is also the original populism that the People's Party of the 1890s espoused, which is, you talk about the elite being an economic elite, ripping off the people, betraying the ideals of the country, making equal opportunity impossible for a lot of people, producing what the original People's Party called two classes, tramps and millionaires, now probably billionaires. But they see the people as sort of, they know they have differences, but basically undifferentiated because they're being ripped off economically. The other kind of populism, which I think Trump represents really, and which has been represented by other groups more or less on the right in American history, like George Wallace in many ways, looks at an elite, an economic elite, a cultural elite, often a political elite, which is betraying the promise of America, but also sees that elite in league with people on the bottom, usually people either recent immigrants or non-white people who grew up in this country, in a kind of unspoken conspiracy to rip off people in the middle. And so the one populism, which again you see on the left with Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and some other Democrats too, but they're obviously the most prominent figures using this kind of language, uses that left wing, that all the people against the small elite. Whereas Donald Trump and also many conservatives who follow him, I think, use more the other one, that is the broad middle against those trying to push their way across the border illegally and those on the top who try to help them do that. How that relates to economics? Well, clearly all of this has been thrown into prominence slowly but surely, but the recession, Great Recession of 07, 08, and 09 made it impossible to ignore. And of course, we saw, after that recession, two kinds of populism which in many ways really represent the two kinds that I mentioned before. In terms of movements, the Occupy movement, which was unorganized and didn't last very long. The Tea Party, which was pretty well organized, also in many ways didn't last very long. But both of them had tremendous impacts, I think, on their political parties. Occupy, despite the fact it was led by anarchists, helped to flow into, I think, a critique of economic power, which is helping to drive progressive campaigns in the Democratic Party. Was the Tea Party, in different ways, I think, fed into the kind of rage by people who ended up voting for Donald Trump. So we have both populisms, they're both connected to economics, but nothing in politics that really matters is only about economics, I think. It's always, what academics call overdetermined, and the overdetermination is happening all around us all the time with all kinds of rage, sometimes flowing through the political system, sometimes flowing outside of it. And I don't think I have anything optimistic to say either.
You can see why. It's kind of fun of it. Someone's got to be the last joke here, right? Okay, so Nick, how is this manifesting itself today, and where do we go?
There's a story I love to tell about Axios since we're so new, is that one of the reasons people love us so much is that we didn't get the 2016 election wrong. It's because we didn't exist. But if I unpack that, we actually did get it wrong. I joined Axios very early on in the summer of 2016, before the election, and spent 6 months looking for a Hillary Clinton reporter. And then on election day, woke up and said, "Oh, I should probably find a Trump reporter instead." And it was very clarifying for me as an editor about there were a lot of these trends that I had missed. I think that a lot of us, particularly in political journalism, had missed. We were not looking at the right voters. We were not looking at the right sort of underlying economic trends, underlying political trends to sort of understand what the electorate was feeling and what was the kind of outcome they were looking for. And what I love about sort of Axios is sort of like now how I view sort of our editorial mission is sort of like focus on those kinds of trends. To look at these sort of half dozen things that are going to shape the next century and how they're sort of driving the movement of people and political power and ultimately policy on all these kinds of things. We look at coverage of something like the future of work. Sort of I love looking at sort of how that trickles out into the populace. When my reporters come to me and say, well, you know what the #1 job category, or among the biggest job categories for men in the United States is? It's a truck driver. You know what one of the biggest job categories for women in the United States is? It's cashier. And now we're thinking, okay, well, those are going to be gone in 5, 6, 7, 10 years. What is the impact of that spilling over into the electorate? When we see that the accumulation of power and wealth and energy in cities, and we see the competition for sort of more people being in cities and companies wanting to locate in cities. The theater of Amazon HQ2, making the 2 biggest, richest cities in the United States compete for the headquarters of one of the biggest, richest companies on earth. What does that mean for the millions and millions of people who don't live in one of those kinds of cities? And how are they being served by the policies and by the politics that are supposed to sort of like making sure that they have jobs, making sure that they have sort of meaningful employment, making sure they have education. It was something that I think was dead on. It was sort of, this is all part of a failure to respond. These are things that we did not talk about. There was a consensus that one way would solve all these kinds of things, and sort of ignored, I think, a lot of these other trends, which we're now very much seeing. Sort of the rise of social media and filter bubbles. Like there's an amazing thing that Mike Allen, who writes our main newsletter, Axios AM, every morning loves to do, is to put on MSNBC and Fox at 9 p.m. each night and just screen grab it. And it's like, those are different planets at that time. And then what is even more fascinating is like forget about the 3 million people who were watching it on cable news, pull that into social media and look at the filter bubbles that Facebook and Twitter create for people and sort of reinforcing these kinds of mechanisms. Like I'll give you like a personal example of that yesterday, is I had to get in an argument with someone who emailed me because he thought that it was chemtrails. So like, I can't fight against this guy on the internet. I sent him a Wikipedia link and called it fake news and said I should learn science. It's like these are people being sort of fed these kinds of information within these kind of filtered bubbles on social media. And what social media has done in an incredible way has given immediate voice and virality to a lot of these kinds of things. So like there are sort of no more filters in something. One person talking can go any kinds of different places. And I think in a lot of ways we as a populace are just now learning kind of how these phones and these networks have rewired our brains, and we haven't sort of figured it out yet. And so now we're in this, I think, we're living this real time, I think, in a political response. There's something fascinating I saw. This is in the Wilmington Trust 2020 Outlook. I'm not even plugging a sponsor. This is just such a good chart that they're releasing tomorrow. They list the policy responses to the wave of populism. And it's a bunch of policies and action that are happening. But it's not on the right. It's not on the left. It's across the spectrum. And it includes even, we're going to debate in the 2020 election next year whether Facebook should be broken. I think that's going to be something that the Democratic nominee very well might talk about. The Republican nominee might agree with them. And I think that is part of this massive feedback loop now that is finally coming forward that we need to deal with. I think what's fascinating for me as a journalist, I get to cover it. I think what's challenging for lots of people in this time, they need to figure out what to do about it.
That's great, and that is a wonderful lead into what I want to do next, which is go to the policy options. We actually have, I would say, I can distinguish 4 variants of a policy response to this situation that essentially tries to re-empower or either re-empower the lower orders or take down the higher orders or something like that. One is the social democratic standard response. What in America we would call more liberalism. In Europe they call social democracy, using the state to basically take more in taxes and help more public programs and things like that. More of the same. Turn America more like Sweden, essentially. To the left of that these days, you have a new set of movements that draw not from social democracy, but from democratic socialism, which is a different variant of the progressive left, which basically is much less interested in keeping capitalism going and milking its proceeds, but basically, assumes a lot of golden eggs and doesn't care about the geese. And so the Warren, Sanders, Ocasio-Cortez crowd, along with the Piketty and wealth tax crowd, I think are in a fundamentally different place than the Social Democrats. They're in the Democratic Socialist camp because they really want to lop off the top of the economic. They want to dispossess the, what is Bernie Sanders say? I hate billionaires. They shouldn't exist. Their natural response to a large object is to try to break it up, that's so you have the Democratic Socialists, the Social Democrats. You have the actually existing populists on today's right, and I say that because it's not entirely clear what. It's clear that the Trump movement is a populist movement, but the actual policy prescriptions and proposals of this are very strange, and if you look just at the policies, you wouldn't say this was populist. If you look at the politics, you would. So I'm not sure how to kind of, let's just call it actually existing Trumpian populism. But you also have, hypothetically on the right, let's say the Ross Douthat, Ryan Salam response that is an entirely healthy, benign, it's an equivalent of essentially a conservative version of social democracy. Take care of the middle orders and working people, but in a more Christian democratic framework rather than a social democratic framework. So of these different types of responses, no, because they're like, what are the different proposals? You said that you think some of the things that are being talked about now just won't work.
Yeah. All right, I'll tell you what I think, and then you could put it somewhere.
Full water anyway.
Okay, so here's what I think. The one that really, there's a few sort of knee-jerk reactions that I really don't like. The one I really don't like is, look, this is your Silicon Valley. Right? We've done all this amazing things. We don't have a growth problem. We just have a redistribution problem. So we're just going to give universal basic income to everybody. I find that just the hubris of that is astounding to me, and I don't think it does anything to address any of the underlying problems. To say, hey, we got 10 to 15% of people in this country who are going to kill it, and we'll just throw some money to the others. I don't think that solves any problem. What I think we need to do is have a whole bunch of policies that are really human capital focused, forward looking, and are investments in people primarily, but also places. So I think there are out of work workers and low wage workers who need wage subsidies, who need assistance paying for housing, for childcare, for college. But fundamentally, what I think we need to do is massively upgrade the skills and potential of more people in this country so that they can be part of our system productively. And the way to do that, I think we need a massive investments in higher education in particular, not paying off college debt for all these people who already went to college or graduate school, okay? Not free college, which will just further stress our already under-resourced public universities and community colleges, but really just build up the capacity of our higher education system. And then we could go down also and realize we need to do a lot more for K through 12 and early childhood. But that's what I would do. I would have a pro-social mobility, a pro-opportunity, a pro-skills approach, as opposed to just sort of much more income distribution, not particularly well targeted to the needy.
That strikes me, by the way, to characterize it as squarely in the centrist consensus of these two types, but toward the social democratic end kind of thing. Michael, first of all, what is your take on the current policy debate? And you know a hell of a lot more about the various trends on these things than I do.
I would take the socialist one out of it. Really, because I don't really think it exists in a serious way. I consider AOC and Sanders and certainly Warren really social democrats. I mean, you probably heard when Sanders is asked, what do you mean by socialism, Rudy? He says, oh, FDR. I know a lot about the history of socialism. That's not socialism. FDR, some would argue, saved capitalism at a time when in Europe, a lot of capitalist countries are going far to the right, and some were going to the left. The Soviet Union, of course, had a lot of credibility, false credibility, we know in retrospect, nevertheless it did. So I think in every case, the people that you call socialists don't want to do away with capitalism. Even if they call themselves socialists, which AOC and Sanders do, and of course Elizabeth Warren does not. What they want to do is do what social democrats in fact of Europe have done. That is, the fancy term is decommodify certain parts of society. Make sure everyone who wants a job, has a right to one. That's not necessarily right away, but at least job training, which can give them a job. That housing is affordable, the healthcare is available, whether through Medicare for all or not, I don't really care. As long as people have the healthcare and they can afford it, and it's good healthcare, I don't care who gives it to them. And in Europe, they have very different systems to do that. Not all single payer by any means. Transportation should be cheap and available, and we're forgetting about a little thing called climate change. What we're going to do about that, and I think it's the progressives in the Democratic Party who have some answers about that. They might be, very expensive answers, but I'm not sure we're going to get solutions to climate change without spending a lot of money, and hopefully it'll be money that's spent on infrastructure the way the Green New Deal wants to do it. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm not a policy person, I'm a historian, I tell stories with hopefully ideas driving them, sometimes just tell stories. But I do think that what progressives in the Democratic Party have going for them right now is they are speaking to solutions to a lot of the grievances, economically based grievances that a lot of Americans have. Now, whether they're very expensive or too expensive or not, whether it involves, 2% tax on billionaires or 6% tax on billionaires, or whether that will make economic growth slow down. I'm not an economist. I can't say about that. But I do know that historically, certain things which seem impossible, which seem as if they are going to wreck the economy, people start doing them, or they're going to lead us towards tyranny, end up becoming common sense for a lot of people. Remember Ronald Reagan said in 1961, if Medicare was passed, future generations will have to read the books what we meant by freedom. I'm paraphrasing. Reagan said it better, as he usually did, even though he was wrong about it. So, I think that we shouldn't use the bugaboo of socialism, which, of course, Donald Trump and the GOP will use a lot in the campaign next year. But what we're really talking about really is, in fact, fulfilling the vision that FDR, at the end of his life, when he gave speeches about an economic Bill of Rights, did have. And I think if countries in Europe can do those things, and have been able to do those things, with many different political parties, sometimes with Christian Democrats running those countries, sometimes with Social Democrats running those countries, I think it would be possible for the US to do that as well.
Hold on a second here. So these are all great policy prescriptions, and these are all glorious and sensible, and you know what? No one would ever retweet this, because that is not what is driving the conversations. Like, what has been so clarifying to me as a journalist watching this, trying to cut through this, and learning a lot about how people consume this kind of information. And it's not a sensible centrist Christian Democrat calling for a slight increase in infrastructure spending to, no, kill them all, or, build a wall. It's like, I think what's really missing here is an understanding of how sort of like, how the debate has been upended by the rise of social media, by the rise of sort of the way people consume information online, by the way people can immediately sort of retreat into sort of these filter bubble areas where none of these kinds of things sort of break through. And like I wrote this down while I was thinking about this. The leading Democratic candidate for the nomination sells on her website mugs that say billionaire tears, right? That's a great mug, that's awesome, but like that's not the beginning point of sort of like a reason. I mean, it's a hilarious thing, like I would buy one, it's delicious. But that is what works online, and I think what people need to do, I think there needs to be a much better understanding of sort of how political actors are beginning to understand that, and how they use that, and how that drives the conversation.
But you're in the media, so maybe we can look to the media to help give voice to centrist, reason, evidence-based things as opposed to just retweetable clickbait.
I do that. I quit my job and I started helped start Axios.com to get you smarter, faster on the topics that matter. Like I'm launching a newsletter on China, on future of work. And then I sit and I look at the traffic every single day. And I was like, oh, we gotta get some impeachment content out there about the latest outrage. I'll say one thing about the challenge exactly on media. And that like medias are struggling to compete for attention. Right? Like I had to get people to pay attention to me. I'm not just competing against the New York Times or Politico. I'm competing against Netflix and Tinder and Google and Amazon, whenever I can move my thumb 2 inches apart to get on my phone. And so we go into analytical meetings. We're like, okay, what is the stuff that's trending on the internet today that we should maybe kind of like, what the wave we can surf? One day, the leading story that we should have been writing to get all the clicks was that time Donald Trump got on Air Force One and get toilet paper on his shoe. Like I don't want to dump on other, but like some very major media organizations wrote that story and surfed that wave, and we were either outraged that President Trump didn't know how to use the bathroom, or we were outraged at liberal media for tweeting that kind of stuff, and that is the sort of information echo chamber.
You know, I think if I could just add, I hear you about social media and how it polarizes people, but I guess I'm the historian here. This is not the first time we've had inflammatory rhetoric on both sides. Take 1896, during Depression, William Jennings Bryan, the populist Democrat, is running against William McKinley, the Republican. William Jennings Bryan gets a nomination by giving a speech, where he said, mankind will not be crucified on a cross of gold. He puts his arms out like this and puts his head to the side, basically saying, I'm Jesus, and wild applause, and bashing millionaires all the time, talking about people with a lot of money are pigs, hogs, he compared it to the hogs. And on the other side, Theodore Roosevelt, a Republican, not yet running for president, says the way to deal with the populists is to put a bunch of the leaders up against the wall and shoot them. So that's 1896, folks.
So it's your point that everything's the same?
No, not the same. I'm just saying inflammatory rhetoric's the same. Now,
William Jennings Bryan didn't have an Instagram account. If he'd put that picture up on Facebook, that would have been awesome.
yeah, he almost went everywhere.
Okay, so what is the difference now?
All I'm saying is we have the rhetoric at our fingertips at all moments, and we feed off it a lot, but it's not new. Polarization is not new. The hatred of people who think that the elite are ripping them off isn't new. The difference is, of course, the context changes, the specific issues they're talking about change. But I think, look, I'm addicted to social media like everybody else, but I think at the same time, it's we can't assume that technology is driving the discussion. I think the two work together.
Can I say something else boring and unretweetable about billionaires, which is now we have this intellectual, I think, backing for the idea of a wealth tax, right? Like Saya Zuckerman, a little bit from Piketty, like really have promoted this idea that a wealth tax, if you set your parameters just right, you could get that to come out of some optimal tax formula. So, I mean, I disagree. We won't get into the reason why I disagree with them on what they say about the wealth tax technically, but they do, you're right, you said this at the beginning, they call for a wealth tax to break up the money up there because it's bad, right? I will say, I do think all the stuff I talked about, I think we need to do a lot more to invest in people and places in this country. That will cost money. And the fact that we have tremendous wealth in this country and tremendous income, that's where we can get it. So I do think the income tax code needs to be more progressive, and the 2017 Tax Act was a really massive missed opportunity in this sense. Like right at a time where we need more revenue, we gave up $1.9 trillion in the 10-year horizon, and we didn't make changes in the tax code that would make it more progressive. So even though I don't, think that billionaires are policy failures, or that we need to go after that money because it's bad, I do think that we need to do more to raise revenue, and the people with a lot of income and wealth are precisely the people we should be raising the revenue from.
I think that's actually a great segue to the general audience discussion that I want to now have to bring everybody else in here into this. But before we do that, I just want to say that I actually think what Nick said is linked to what you guys said, and it's why I'm going to put this back in here. Because
It's vodka, really, folks.
the next issue of the magazine, the Jan Feb issue of Foreign Affairs, actually is, it just went to press last night, is the lead package is on the future of capitalism. And we're having some of these debates actually in there, including 3 different Nobel laureates. But it did help clarify as we went through all the arguments for and against this, including having Zuckman in there and wealth tax arguments, including was that I think that the point Nick made about there are people having a constructive discussion about how to restructure the imbalanced structures of economic opportunity in society and what's the best way of doing that. And there are constructive discussions occurring about that in wonky seminar rooms across Washington and grassroots levels in a lot of places. But that's not sexy, it's not fun, it's not interesting, and what's driving not just national discussion, but national politics these days is a much more negative, hostile form of politics that's more geared towards destruction rather than creation on all sides. And that actually is what I would say separates the ends from the middle, which is that the key thing about what I would call the conservative populism, or Catholic, conservative populism and conservative attempts to constructively deal with the economic issues of inequality we're talking about, the economic problems, and the lefty progressive ones, is that they actually are trying to solve the problems and deal with them in harnessing the incredibly productive powers of markets and deploying some of those goods to public goods rather than private goods. That's a kind of general consensus post-depression that the ideological compromises of the middle of the century essentially agreed on. But then there are people on either side of that who are not necessarily interested in that same game. And I think the wealth tax, for me, as we were editing this issue, the wealth tax came up as a big thing. Wealth tax is a pretty darn radical move. It would, when you start to game out what it would mean, it's not taking more, it's not eliminating the carried interest tax. It's not raising the higher rates a little bit on other companies or things. A wealth tax is a fundamentally giant intrusion of government into the economic sphere, which would make the holding of demonstrable assets something that every single rich person would try to game out and escape. Capital would flee the country. There would be incredible industry for lawyers and accountants getting away from it. Everybody would have to give all their information. So I think that the wealth tax, as opposed to higher income taxes, is the kind of thing that separates the people who are trying to milk the cow from the ones who just want milk. And because you have to care about the health of the cow if you want to milk it. And it's not clear to me that the extremes on either of the populist sides care about the health of the cow, whereas all the ones in the middle do and are trying to keep it going while making it go. But with that, we've talked enough. What would you all like to ask, Ms. and Mr. Wizards? Over here, please rise and state your name and ask your question.
Harsha Martley, what does it count to address this argument that technological innovation, artificial intelligence, is by definition going to eliminate a class of workers, like we saw in the Industrial Revolution, and that no matter how much education you give people, you're going to a fundamental displacement. So we will always have this, both Bible, we will always be for federal government.
Really economics.
Yeah. So I don't subscribe to the robot or AI apocalypse view of labor market trends. It's certainly true that industrial robots in particular have put a lot of people out of work in certain sectors in particular. It's certainly true that AI is replacing types of jobs. There's two views on this. The most sanguine is there's always been this. People said this in the Industrial Revolution, and we moved from an agricultural society to a non-agricultural society, right? So there's always a period of adaptation. I'm hopeful that we will have another period of adaptation and new jobs that we can't conceive of now will be created. I do worry that the pace at which AI is developed and new technology developed is so rapid now that it's hard for the adjustment period, both at the firm level to capitalize on these new technologies and at the worker level to get re-skilled and retooled. So that I think is a real challenge, but the idea that artificial intelligence is just going to wipe out a whole bunch of jobs and there won't be new jobs created to take the place, that seems too pessimistic to me.
By the way, the more I do on biotechnology, the more we read articles on that, I've become less worried about the robots, because I think the robots are going to download themselves into us, with just the bodies being the genetic programmed bodies. So the biotechnology stuff is even scarier than the AI stuff.
I think Melissa hit on a key point there in that, yes, like we've invented cars before, we don't ride horses, we've gone through the same kind of transitions before. But what we ask a ton, what I like to put my reporters on, sort of like exploring this is asking, is this time different? Right? There's always that hanging out there, and then what is that lag, right? Is the lag between you losing your job as a cashier and this magical new thing being created, okay, does that take 24 hours, or does that take 25 years? And I think there's a lot of sort of like, there's no, I don't think there's any consensus on sort of how long that can take, and I think what the real challenging from a policy standpoint is how do you prepare and navigate for however long that gap is? Because if I'm a 52-year-old cashier and I lose my job as a cashier because Amazon Go came to town, there's not another job probably, no matter what that time frame is. Okay, so how does society prepare for that?
So my question on that.
It's not a solution, but what doesn't scare me, about automation and AI so much is democracy, is politics. That is, if unemployment doubled or tripled and there's no way to find jobs for people, whoever's in charge of the country at the time and the party in charge would get voted out, right? And whoever came in would have to do something analogous to what the Democrats under FDR did in the Great Depression. They'd have to create jobs, or income, whether UBI is a good idea or not, because people will not, otherwise you'd have chaos, in the country, as there was for a while in the 30s anyway. So I guess as long as we have democracy and as long as people are able to vote, then politics and economics, as always, are connected. These people political economy, which is a better term for it. And so I think, you can't game out what's going to be like 25 years from now without thinking about how the politics is going to affect it.
Agreed. And the changes in technology that occurred in the late 19th and early 20th centuries dwarfed the stuff that's occurring now, and things managed to survive, and the system somehow found ways to generate things. But it still seems like the pace of change today is occurring so rapidly that it's almost hard to absorb. It also seems like this income structure is changing so much that in order to generate the funds, if you have an increasingly stratified income distribution with a huge number of gazillionaires at the top and a mass of relatively ordinary people lower down, then the only way to generate the funds needed is to have some sort of giant taxes in which it's like more like a Roman system in which a bunch of rich people are occasionally putting on festivals for everybody else than one in which it's a true democracy, even if you sanctified it by saying this is a tax structure.
Well, we do know that, right, the rich class has created a whole bunch of jobs that didn't exist before, and there's been a tremendous growth in service sector jobs. But those generally are low paying, right? So that's great that people now have more gardeners and more babysitters and they get more manicures, but those are not high paying jobs. And so that's where you have to think about.
All those were the jobs that were taken by the immigrants who are no longer.
So, no, but the serious thing is, so a lot of the jobs that have been replaced were middle-skilled jobs, and people have either been pushed up or pushed down. And so that, again, is going to call for, if that's going to be the system of job, or the structure of jobs that we have, then we need to anticipate, higher wage subsidies to the folks who are filling these lower-paying service sector jobs.
Or make it easier to organize unions. hate to be the resident leftist here, but you know,
It's your role, go for it.
I mean, you know, steel workers used to get paid like crap. Auto workers used to get paid like crap. Then they unionized, and then they were able to get 2-week vacations and you know go fishing and a little place that they had and nice cars and afford a house in the suburbs and some became Republicans, you know. But that's fine. You know? So I think again, the difference in Europe is that even though unions have declined in Europe too, for kinds of reasons we've talked about, still union density is much higher in I think pretty much every European country than it is in this country. And you know that one of the things that's happened, you know, with this wave of populism or neo-socialism, call it what you will, is the 5 for 15 and states passing and municipalities run by Democrats passing laws to lift the minimum wage, which is a movement that actually was led by the SEIU, by you know major union really, without getting much benefit from it in terms of members. So again, political economy, folks.
So, Michael, okay, so I'm gonna press you on this. Okay, since you raised it, it's fair game. It's like the lawyer, you know, you raised it in the defense and now we can cross-examine
The
it.
prosecutor.
If you want the United States, if your prescription more generally, okay, be more social democratic, more, you know, the traditional compromise and go forward in more social programs, higher social insurance, not radical crazy things that would kill the goose, but just divert more resources to public goods, public investment and so forth, along the lines of Northern Europe and so forth. If that's actually what happened in Sweden, in Northern Europe, in the third quarter and the fourth quarter of the 20th century, and it didn't ultimately fully work in the sense that it didn't get to the end of history. The social democracy, and the self-confident social democracy in Sweden and the North European, Scandinavian model welfare states look a little more troubled now than they did a generation ago, and they're facing their own populist challenges. So why should we expect that even if your solutions, if the countries that embodied your solutions are still facing populist challenges, why is there still a populist challenge on the left and to the right in Europe if the left has done what you wanted it to do?
Well, two things. First of all, history doesn't end. So, you know, like Sweden couldn't freeze itself in 1955. And also, one of the leading populist challenges to this country in Europe is from the right, and it's about migrants. And I mean, Sweden still has a very strong welfare state, but one of the growing parties there is called the Sweden Democrats, who were originally a kind of neo-Nazi party. Anybody there probably read Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, or saw the movie. That was the neo-Nazi party there, and they had half of 1% of the vote 20 years ago. Now they have 14 to 15% of the vote. And what's that about? It's not about, you know, we don't want the welfare state. It's about we don't want Syrians and Lebanese and Arabs and Africans to take part in this welfare state. So one of the things I'm more optimistic about American politics is, of course, there's lots of anti-immigrant feeling. Of course, there's the controversy about migration, migrants on the border and so forth, what kind of immigration policy to have. But I don't think, and we'll see what happens in 2020, how President Trump runs his campaign, I don't think you can convince the majority of Americans to vote for a party or not to vote for it based on that issue, primarily. So, you know, one of the things that happened in Europe, you had these, you know, these homogeneous populations adopting a social democracy, and they were sort of caught unawares that other people, you know, in poorer countries wanted to come there. Now, we can argue what economically, if that is sustainable in the long run. I'll cede to the economist about that, but obviously Keynes was right, in the long run we're all dead. So, you know, I do think that the populist challenge to those societies does not come because the economics wasn't working. It comes because the cultural assimilation process wasn't working.
I have one immigration data point that sort of fits into mine. Donald Trump spends more money advertising on Facebook right now for the 2020 election than all Democrats combined. He advertises on one main issue, it's immigration.
But that's where it's based.
Yes, we do.
Cynthia Roberts, I'm currently a
Hold on a second, wait for my team.
Oh, sorry. Cynthia Roberts, my question's on education. I'm currently a CFR fellow at the Joint Staff, and obviously my question has nothing to do with them. For a number of decades, I've been teaching at a public institution in New York City, and unlike Gideon, my interest in opera is fulfilled by dreaming up algorithms to try and win the rush tickets to get to the Metropolitan. But for a few decades, we have seen, and I have seen the experience on the education front and on the immigration front, the most successful students generally come from somewhere else, you know, whether it's Russia, China, India, you name it. And they're the ones in the classes on ordinary differential equations, and they succeed in getting high acceptance rates into graduate school. And the education issue isn't resolved just at the university level. In our university, it's publicly funded, and it's a huge bonus for immigrants coming in. But these are principally immigrants who have good education at the lower levels. So my question is, especially for our economists in the room, that if you fund higher education, which is now globalized, you're still going to have the outcomes that you get if we don't fix the K through 12 system. And our K through 12 system is really badly broken. And I haven't heard on the left or the right any solution that I think would work. And I wonder what all of you think could fix that. Thank you.
Melissa?
Sure. So I agree that K through 12 needs to be a priority. I mean, I'm sure you just saw it. The recent NAEP scores came out, and the U.S. is abysmal. I mean, it's really preposterous how poorly our kids score compared to other kids in other countries. So I agree. I think the reason why I called out higher ed is because there's a lot of debate about how to reform K through 12. Higher ed, I think we just don't have the awareness or commitment to funding it. And so what has happened, I mean, we actually, our high school seniors, we have more people going to college than ever. So I actually don't think the problem is, oh, we don't have enough people graduating from high school anymore, and we don't have enough people going to college. You know, now the majority of young adults start college, but they don't finish. And the problem is half of college students in this country are at community colleges. So I should be clear too, because I should be careful. When I say college in a room like this, most people have in mind a highly selective four-year college. That is not what college is to most American college students. Most American college students are at a non-selective school, and community colleges in particular are very accessible, and they're all over the country. They're dramatically underfunded, and first, certainly since 2008, the financial crisis, all states cut funding to public higher education institutions, and very few states have restored that funding. So at the same time, we are sending more students to college, and what economists have found who have looked at this isn't my own research, the really low completion rates of kids going to college, you could say, well, it's because now we're sending more kids to college and they're less prepared. But in fact, what it looks like is we're sending more kids to college and they're going to these under-resourced schools. And so there's a big gap in educational attainment for kids who get to go to the four-year flagship school and all of the other places, which is really where we need to be pushing, not only for the kids who get through K through 12, but this gets back to the other point, which is we've got these changes in technology. People are going to have to be getting retooled throughout their life, and that I think is going to happen at their local community college or their local institution of public higher ed.
All right, Jake, I'm gonna bundle last two questions here, you, and then we'll just get them on, and then we'll wrap up as well.
Hi, my name is Charlie Manel. I'm a founder of a technology company. And I have my oldest just turned college age, and I meet a lot of kids coming out of college and college now. And I'm just astounded how many of them just accept that socialism is a better economic system than capitalism. It is an epidemic. It's pretty much outside of the engineers. Every single young person I talk to thinks socialism is superior. And we have a historian here, I blame you, for not presenting the full aspects of socialism.
It is my fault.
And I want a rigorous debate about how capitalism has raised billions of people out of poverty. And socialism, yeah, it's pretty successful in homogenous environments, and there's been a lot of reforms in the European Scandinavian countries because they went too socialist in the 70s. They implemented capitalist reforms, and they became more successful. And now they're having the challenges that you talked about when you get away from the homogenous. But I want some truth. I want our young people to say, hey, just don't accept that socialism works because you do kill the peace. And so I'd like to hear a little bit more about what's going on in higher education and why so many of these kids aren't learning both sides. At least let them make a decision based on facts as opposed to just what's going on now?
I think those polls are even more frightening than you think. When you ask college students how they feel about freedom of speech and the First Amendment, and there's like, we've done stories on, you ask like 5 or 6 very basic American bedrock questions.
That's always
and
been
then
true.
trace it down.
At
and
any
then
time in
you-
American history, if you put the Bill of Rights up for a popular vote, most of them wouldn't have passed, actually. Which is, Michael, is that true? But we got to turn around. Well, one last bit here, one thing it is. Anyway, one time we got a mic to your right, right there. To your right.
I recommend that you send your kid to Vietnam, which is the most capitalist country in the world. See how that.
That wouldn't have been said at Council on Foreign Relations events a couple of generations ago.
No, that's true. But to some extent, it seems to me that the conversation has ignored a basic primal human emotion, which is envy. There seems to me in all of this conflict between the rich and the poor, the notion that it's a zero-sum game. The poor believe that they're poor because somebody got their money. Somebody got there first, they had an advantage, they took their money. And I was intrigued by your comment about, I mean, certainly Professor Gurney, your notion of, trying to educate and skill up the lower classes is a great idea. I was intrigued by your notion of public assets. And one wonders perhaps whether or not natural resources and those kinds of things aren't public property that ought to be used as opposed to taking somebody's wealth.
Thank you very much. You know, we are actually out of time. One of the things, the hallmarks of these events is we actually do
I never get any
move
answers.
forward. But we also have some wonderful things coming up next. Let me just, when capitalism emerged in the 18th century, thinkers like Voltaire and Hume celebrated its material benefits and the progress it would generate in human lives. And Rousseau responded to them by saying, people really hate inequality. They care about social status. It's a zero-sum game. And they're always miserable because they're going around comparing themselves with everybody else. And capitalism and markets, they just generate more and more inequality. And so it's going to make people even more miserable. Smith comes along a generation later and says, you know what? Look, we're going to produce so much good stuff that everybody is going to be materially well off. And that's going to solve the problem. And in some ways, we're still 2 centuries on making the same debate, because Smith was right that there's an ever-increasing productive capacity of generating universal opulence to capitalism that's managed to continue to generate giant cornucopia of benefits. But the humans in it are still the same humans, and they still have sometimes Rousseau's comparative status as well. And so blending the inequality and the advance is the challenge that capitalism and democracy face when you try to combine them together, as we have done in this country and hopefully will continue to do. And I want to thank our panelists, and I want to thank all of you for this discussion of issues that we are going to continue discussing for a very long time and are very important. So thank you very much for being here with us. It is now my great pleasure to welcome the real talent, to a certain extent. We have David Rubenstein and Larry Kudlow coming up. So David Rubenstein is the co-founder and the executive chairman of the Carlyle Group. He is the chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations and a great guy. And Mr. Kudlow is, of course, the assistant to the president for economic policy and the director of the Economic Council. So stay tuned for that. We're going to take off here and be right back in a second with more programs.
we're doing great.
Maybe swap you out.
Getting better.
We got two. In theory, we only have about half hour left, so
yeah, it just dropped down to 2 bars.
Yeah.
Like,
All right. I'll just leave this with you in case, but I think you should be good.
I mean, this would probably be.
It's gonna be another half hour. Yeah.
You want me to should I go in on these guys, or do you guys like to?
Thank you very much for coming, and everybody please turn their cell phones off if they haven't already done so. We're very honored and pleased to have the President's Economic Advisor, the head of the Council of the Economic Council at the White House, Larry Kudlow here. So Larry, thank you for coming over here from the White House and telling us everything about what's going to happen in the economy.
Appreciate it.
For those who may not be that familiar with Larry, and I think everybody is, but just briefly, Larry is a well-known economist. He started his career after graduating from the University of Rochester, where he was a tennis star. He came to the Federal Reserve, later went to Bear Stearns, later came to the OMB, became the chief economist under Ronald Reagan at OMB, went back to Bear Stearns, became its chief economist, and then after that, he also began a series of radio shows and television shows, and in April of last year, he was appointed to be the head of the National Economic Council by President Trump.
A couple of years ago, Woodrow Wilson was president.
Okay. In addition to that, everything. Okay. So, let's start with the easy thing. When are we getting the deal with China? Is that going to be, because the president, it was kind of leaked, now obviously leaks aren't always accurate, but it was sort of leaked that maybe there'd be a signing in Chile when the APEC summit was there, but the summit was called off, but why shouldn't call off the signing if it was ready to be signed? So is it ready to be signed?
As the president said yesterday in New York, yesterday. When did he speak? Yesterday, thank you. I believe he used the word soon.
Okay.
He used the word soon.
So you don't want to modify anything he said?
Well, I think as circumstances in Chile changed, the basic view of both teams was to try to stay on APEC time.
Okay.
Now, what APEC time means is subject to great interpretation, I think. But the idea was we're getting close, as the president has indicated, and soon.
Okay, so I assume I'm not going to get any more out of you. So, Tanya, but let me ask you a related question. Do you need to have a physical signing where the President of the United States and the President of China actually are physically together to kind of give a great video? Why not just do it if it's ready before they can get together physically?
Well, that's an interesting point. I mean, you could.
Which way do you think you're going?
It's there's a couple things here. It's phase one, so it infers phase two and perhaps even phase three, what the president said. I think President Trump would like a signing. We are communicated that President Xi is interested in a signing. It's not a categorical imperative, as your question suggests. I think they both like to do it, but I don't honestly know how that turns out.
Do you think it should be in a neutral country? In other words, not in China, not in the United States, but some country other than one of those two countries?
I think, frankly, I've thought long and hard about this. It should be in my office on the second floor of the West Wing. I don't like to travel. I don't like to fly.
That's the news you're going to get tonight. It's going to be there. Okay.
It may not happen that way, but
okay. So on the agreement, I know you're not going to tell us anything very specific about it, but do you think it's an agreement that the president will feel it reduces the trade deficit a bit? Because that was his initial impetus behind the agreement, I thought.
yes. Well, there are a lot of other things. Just in that last clause, trade imbalance is one issue, but the structural issues were paramount. The IP theft and the forced transfer of technology, and there's a lot of non-tariff and tariff barriers and subsidies, cyber interference. So it was a very large package of, shall I say, imbalances that we objected to. I don't want to suggest, I mean, as the president himself said yesterday, and it's pretty much been his mantra for the past week, he likes what he sees. He's not ready to make a commitment. He hasn't signed off on a commitment for phase one. There is no agreement just yet for phase one. And it has to be a good deal for the United States. I mean, his job is to defend the economy and the national security of the U.S., as you know very well. But the way I characterize it is the mood music is pretty good. It has not always been so in these things. And they're discussing matters. Teleconference type meetings are going on as we talk. We just had, the reason I had Russell over there, we had a meeting of our trade principals group to talk about that and many other things. So it's not done yet, but there has been very good progress and the talks have been very constructive.
Okay, so soon and constructive, those are the key words. Okay, so let's go to another trade agreement.
My office.
In your office, okay. Another trade agreement. Nancy Pelosi said today that she thought it was relatively likely that soon, also, USMCA would be approved by the House and then presumably the Senate. Do you agree with that likelihood?
I hadn't heard that she'd said that. Where did she say that?
In the House today, I guess in a press briefing she gave.
Good. I mean, it's interesting on that, where obviously we have our political differences with the Speaker and so forth. But on USMCA, she has been cooperative, open, accessible, helpful. Trade Ambassador Bob Lighthizer, who was the lead negotiator on that, has worked very well with the Speaker and her leading committee chairman folks. And I've always felt that that there would be a distinction between this deal, which is, in my view, virtually a template for a good trade deal. It's pro-growth, jobs, investment. It helps what I would call old economy, whether you're a manufacturer, auto worker, automaker, farmer, but also the new economy side of this, which is often overlooked in the discussions, with respect to, again, intellectual property, opening up for digital services, financial services, things of that sort. It's a very well-rounded, very positive deal. There's a currency stability clause in that deal, and I think it would be very helpful for all sections of the country. It's not a political deal. It was always designed by Bob Lighthizer and the rest of us to be a bipartisan deal. And so I'm glad to hear what you just said. But that's been her attitude right through, and I give her a lot of credit for it.
Now, it's been reported in the press that you were working on a proposal for a second-term tax cut. And is there any truth to that? And what details can you give us about that?
There is truth to it. We call it Tax Cuts 2.0. The aim would be to improve or enlarge middle-class tax relief, and there are no specifics.
Okay. But do you think the specifics will be made public before the presidential election?
I would expect that kind of package, where I'm sort of heading up, would come out sometime, perhaps the middle of next year. It would be a campaign-oriented package. It would essentially be geared towards a longer-run view of how to improve U.S. economic growth, how to reform the tax system, which needs considerable additional reform. Again, how to help middle-income families, working families, and there'll be I'm trying to, and again, we're in the very early stages of this, talking to people on the Hill, House, Senate, our people, outside people, Democrats and Republicans. I really would love. I know a lot of Democrats, David. I know a lot of Democrats. Many of them appeared on my TV show to the benefit of the show and myself. Many of them have visited me in the office, and I intend to solicit some of their views.
You were a Democrat early in your college career, right? SDS.
Actually, I was a Democrat, right?
Is that right?
My last Democrat assignment was the late Senator Pat Moynihan.
Okay, so.
Proud of it.
now
He was a Republican Democrat.
So, tax
He was
cuts,
also a great man.
the last tax cut, whether you agree with all of it or not, it seems as if it's going to produce a larger deficit than maybe people would like. We're gonna be running an annual deficit of over $1 trillion. Are you worried about these deficits and the ultimate debt we are incurring?
Well, give us, let's see, the thing was signed in late 17, so give us a couple of years to see the deficit impact, the growth impact in particular, which will drive the deficit. We've run up against, unfortunately, very, very tight money. The Fed slammed on the brakes in 17, especially 18, which gave us a soft couple of quarters, which slows down the revenues and slows down GDP. So my feeling is now, I think that the Fed has taken the foot off the brake, and I think that's going to help the economy. And I think the incentives of those, particularly on the business side, the incentives made themselves known, then softened a bit. I'm looking for quite a pickup in economic growth in the fourth quarter and into next year. And I think those deficit numbers, particularly on the revenue side, are going to show a lot of improvement.
For this year, the economic GDP growth will be roughly 2%. Would you think that's about right?
Let's see, 3, 2, 2. I think we'll be about 2.25 to 2.5.
Okay. So, speaking of the Fed, the president's speech yesterday at the New York Economic Club suggested he wasn't completely thrilled with the chairman of the Fed. And when you kind of beat up on the chairman of the Fed, does it usually work, or does it usually produce resistance? And is that the best way to convince him to do what you want?
This is not a trick question.
Well, it's an easy question. But you can dodge that question if you like. But
Look, the president has made his views on Fed very
okay, so
outspoken about that. So I don't really need to say anything more. I would say that my first job at the New York Fed in open market operations, so I've watched it for a long time. I have a sandwich every month with Jay Powell. We talk about life, liberty, and pursuit of prosperity. I think right now the Fed is moving in the right direction, in my view. The President said, he may have said it yesterday, that they were too fast to tighten and too slow to ease. I think that's an apt characterization, but I think they're on the right track right now. And I actually think the economy is going to benefit from their change of heart.
and the futures markets are suggesting today that it's not likely there's going to be another Fed interest rate cut before the next election. That's the market saying. They're not always right. So would you be very disappointed if there's no Fed cut between now and the next presidential election?
Not particularly. I mean, I like a lot of things I see. So it's, I guess, less than 50% between now and year end is the last thing in the Fed funds futures market. That may have changed today. I'm a bit out of touch. The thing that I like here is, in recent months we've had a terrific stock market rally, and that rally has been led by the so-called cyclical stocks, industrials, technology, commodities, financials. That's a great sign for future business conditions. If you go back a year ago, when the Fed was in the throes of slamming on the brakes, the market was very poor, and those cyclical areas were showing an expectation of softer business conditions. Proved to be accurate barometer. So I like what I see from the stock market right now, and I like what I see from the bond market, because, without getting too technical, but the yield curve, the slope of the yield curve is now upward, not inverted. That's a positive sign. I was always interested to see many of my political reporter friends talking about the inverted yield curve over the course of the summer, predicting recession and so forth. But I don't see any of them coming back now, talking about how the curve is normalized, the stock market's going up, the most economic sensitive parts of the stock market are going up, the housing market is improving enormously, that itself is a leading indicator, all the housing indicators. The job numbers are coming in, I won't say spectacularly, but very, very good. Even last month with the revisions and so forth, the numbers were absolutely terrific. Wages are coming in very well. In fact, the production workers have a faster wage increase than their managers. I think that's a big point. We've seen articles from the Census Bureau that median incomes adjusted for inflation and taxes are up something like $5,000 in less than 3 years. This really is a middle-class boom that's going on right now, in my judgment. I don't see any end to it. It's a much stronger performance than the prior administration. I don't really want to go down that path, but I'm saying just in 3 years, we've made tremendous progress that we had made, by the way, in the prior 2 administrations, if I can be completely nonpartisan. So I like the shape of things, and I like the momentum of things. That's why I'm an optimist heading through the end of this year and into next year.
Okay, so the prospect of a recession in 2020, you think is nil, really?
Look, I've seen lots of models about this. It can never be nil, but some well-regarded forecasters who were saying 40–50% chance of recession are down to 20% or some such. I would agree with that assessment. It's a very low probability of recession.
Okay, can you describe the economic decision-making process? You run the council, and you make recommendations to the president, or is it Secretary of Treasury and you come up with ideas and you take it to the president orally? What's the process for economic decisions to be made?
Well, you have the NEC, of course the Treasury Department, my friend Stephen Mnuchin. You have the Council of Economic Advisors, headed by Tomas Philipson right now. So it is a collaborative effort in that respect. We meet frequently, either singly or as a group or more formally. The way the president runs the White House is very hands-on. He's much like a businessman, a decisive businessman. I'm personally in and out of the Oval, or the back of the Oval, where that little dining room is. Some of the others, Mnuchin is too. Bob Lighthizer is so important on trade. So it's a collaborative. Team up.
Now, the ongoing discussions in the House about impeachment, do you see them having any impact on the economy, or the president's ability to provide the leadership on the economy that he wants to provide is having impact on your ability to do your job?
Certainly has no impact on my job. And I think in the market sense, the only time I really looked, the day the impeachment vote was made, the market was off a couple of hundred points. Other than that, I think it's had virtually no impact. I don't think it's going to have any impact on the economy at all.
So you were, before you came down, as I said, you had a pretty prosperous career in the private sector. Any second thoughts about coming down here, working the 70-hour weeks for modest compensation and public criticism every day by somebody or another, I suspect? So any second thoughts about doing this?
No.
Okay.
I love this job.
Okay.
I just want to say that. I love this job. Without question, it's the most fun I've ever had. No question. I want to also say I have done a lot of things. I've been in and out of government and Wall Street and was a professional broadcaster for many years. I knew a little bit about a lot of issues, but there are more issues that I'm confronted with than ever before. More work to catch up. National Economic Council has a brilliant staff. We've made changes over the 2 years that I've been there. We had the international side called Intercon, which was shared by NSC and EC, and Robert O'Brien just handed over Intercon restructurings here. In fact, my new deputy, Tom's over there. It's sometimes hard, but it's fascinating. It's just very interesting. And I want to also say, there's never been a day when I walk into the Oval or go into the back of where that little dining room is, that I don't feel charged up. I feel a responsibility to give it the best shot I have and present the best information.
But your commitment, if everything else holds out, is to stay through the end of the term, right?
I would expect so.
Okay. Now, some people wonder about your health.
Yeah.
How is your health?
Good.
Okay. All right. So.
I am. I walked in. It's the end of the day. I'm getting peppered by questions. It's a lovely looking audience. Maybe some of you agree with me, maybe, if I'm lucky. I've enjoyed it. I had a hip replacement about 5 months ago, and I've been on the tennis court the last couple of months and getting my game back into shape. Before I had the hip replacement, they gave me a thoroughgoing checkup, so the ticker is ticking very well.
Okay.
And by the way, the healthcare at Walter Reed is very good. I recommend it to anybody. And,
I don't know if everybody would get treated as well as the head of the Council on Economic. Okay, I'm sure they treat everybody
it's
very
a
well.
pretty darn good place, and there are a lot of wonderful, brave, honorable people, veterans and so forth, who are at Walter Reed Hospital. They have tremendous health care.
So,
And I feel, bottom line is, I feel great. If you're ready to
So-
rock at the end, we'll see.
all right, if somebody is watching, or they're here and they say, I hear what you say, it's a pretty good message, is now the time for me to put money in the stock market because it's gonna go further up from here? Or is this a time I should, be a little cautious, it can't get much better than it is now?
You know, my philosophy down through the years, sometimes subject to great praise and sometimes subject to great criticism, is to buy the broad indexes and hold on to them. All right, I believe in stocks for the long run. I'm a disciple of Professor Jeremy Siegel of Penn. I don't believe you can outguess the market. I have many brilliant people in the money management, hedge funds, management business. I still think over the long run the market does the best. That's what the data show, and that's my philosophy. So if you're a young person, you should be investing and holding, do not panic. I remember in the worst of it in 2008, when I was still working at CNBC, Mr. Warren Buffett came on the morning show, and things were very grim, and I'll never forget, he said his advice was for people to buy the market, to buy the broad indexes. He said, I may be 25% early or I may be 50% early, but you should buy them and then hold them. And if you did that, you'd have made out very, very well. That's my long-term view, it always has been.
But with a touch of some private equity.
If you hang in there, part of our China reforms is
Okay.
you might be able to open an office there and you can own it 100%.
All right, well-
Now I've given away a detail.
All right,
for
I'm
this
looking
deal.
forward to that. So, a final question, because our time is up, and I appreciate your adjusting your schedule to come over. So, if somebody is watching, what would be the main message you'd want to convey about the U.S. economy today or the next year or so?
Well, look, I think the outlook is very bright. And I think that the president's policies of low taxes, rollback of regulation, reopening energy markets, and fighting hard to lower trade barriers, I think these are pro-growth policies. As he said in New York yesterday, we have provided new incentives for the American workforce, the American entrepreneur, the American investor, across the board incentives. We believe it should. Successful efforts, no matter who you are in what walk of life, success should be rewarded, not punished. And people should be willing to take risks. And this is part of the American belt on China. It always has been part of our of our dream. I think the country is very strong. We are in the throes of a transformative policy. There's no question about that. I did this once many years ago under President Reagan, who had transformative policies. Today, President Trump is transforming and rebuilding the economy and our trade relationships and our national security relationships. I happen to believe fervently it's the right course. I think the early results show we are doing rather well, despite little bumps here or a little Fed tightening there. I think we've done very well. Again, unemployment and wages and real median incomes. I mean, there is a worker boom going on out there. Most people doubted it was possible. And I think we've created something like 7 million new jobs in whatever, 2.5 years. Those are pretty hefty numbers. And I haven't seen numbers like that in over 20 years. So I'm very optimistic. I think this is a great country. I'm sure you all do too. I'm sure you do too. You've had a great success story yourself. Congratulations. Basically, I'm honored and blessed to have this job. That's the way I look at it. I'm honored and blessed to have this job, and it's an honor for me to work under this president.
Thank you very much for taking the time, and thank you for adjusting your schedule to be here tonight.
Good evening, everybody. Well, it's truly humbling and it's an honor to be on the stage following those gentlemen. So I'm a pretty simple guy. I'm an investor. I know who Wagner was. I even went to a Wagner opera once, but I didn't make it past the second act. It was the first act that I remember. There's a lot of acts in Wagner operas. But as an investor, I try not to be prescriptive, and I try not to provide answers to a lot of these policy questions. What we try to do is figure out what's going to happen, how all these various things might come to play with the most likely course of action is. And based on that, make decisions around how to invest. So I'm going to start with a couple of quotes that relate to populism. We'll see if anybody knows who said these quotes. The first one is, the most perfect political community is one in which middle class is in control and outnumbers both of the other classes. Anybody who said that? That was Aristotle. That was the oldest quote I could find that related to populism, 2,300 years ago. The next one, see if anybody can get this one. Pundits talk about populist rage as a way to trivialize the anger and fear coursing through the middle class. That's a pretty recent one. Any ideas? That was Elizabeth Warren. So I chose those two quotes because there's 2,300 years between those quotes, and history repeats itself. And so the question that I think we have to ask ourselves now is, why is populism manifesting itself again right now? So I have a third quote that I think answers the question, largely answers the question. So here's the third quote. If workers who have lost out to automation do not accept labor market outcomes, they will resist the force of technology through non-market mechanisms, such as political activism. Anybody know? We lost our economist. She left. She might have known who it was. So that was by a guy named Joel Mokyr, who's a famous economist today at Northwestern. And the key about this quote is that it identifies the key idea that's been driving populism, which is automation. And Melissa talked about a period of adaptation, and that's essentially what we believe is happening right now. Last year, we had a capital market forecast, and we introduced the idea of what we call the fourth industrial revolution. And we talked a lot about the idea of productivity. And productivity is critical, because productivity essentially tells you how healthy your economy is, whether you can be more efficient per unit of input in terms of the output that the economy produces. So productivity is the most important metric when we think about where an economy is going. And I'm going to talk a bit about productivity for the next 5 or 10 minutes, but I'm going to try to make it as interesting as possible for everybody. So let me tell you a quick story. About a month and a half ago, I was home on a rainy Saturday afternoon, and my wife was off at the mall with my older kid, my older daughter, teenage daughter, and my younger daughter, who's 10, came in and said, "Dad, I'm bored, I want to go to the movies." I said, "Okay." Actually, the way she said it is, "Dad, Mommy said that if I asked you nicely, you'd take me to the movies." So I was done. What could I do at that point? I had to take her to the movies. So then she pulls out her phone and she says, "Look, I've got our seats all picked out, and if we leave right now, we can catch the beginning of the movie. I just need your credit card." So I said, "Okay, here's the credit card. Go to the movies." She buys the seats on the way to the movies. We get there, and the movies today, at least in the suburbs where I live, you get in the seat and it goes down like an airplane. So we get to the seats. The first thing I do is I start putting my seat down. And we went right in, didn't buy any popcorn or anything. And she says, "Dad, there's a little screen here, and if you give me your credit card, I can buy the popcorn. They'll bring it right to me." Okay, it's a confined environment. What bad could happen? I give her the credit card, put it down. I don't even make it through the previews. I'm asleep. Wake up at the end of the movie, look over at her, and she says, "I don't feel so well, Dad." So I looked at her little screen. There was a tub of popcorn, there was a soda, there was a box of candy. She didn't even make it to the hot dog. That was just sitting there, hadn't been touched. So, of course, between us, what I thought was immediately, I wish she had bought the combo package. I would have at least saved $10 on that. So I spent about $60 taking her to the movie and her buying popcorn. Think about the productivity of that movie scene that she had due to technology. And I can go on and on and on. We've all been through the airports, whether it be National or LaGuardia. You get lunch, you go and you sit down, there's an iPad. Within 5 minutes, you have your meal, comes right to you. So our economy is being massively disrupted by technology, and it's everywhere. And we have 3 themes in our capital market forecast that relate in some way to productivity. I'm going to go through them really quickly. The first theme is what we call the productivity paradox. And the paradox is that we see productivity all around us. I just gave you a couple of examples. It's on our phones. It's everything that we do in life today is radically transforming. But when we look at the government stats, we have the slowest productivity growth that we've ever seen since World War II in any economic expansion. So why is that? That's the paradox of productivity. We know it's there, but we don't see it in the stats. So the first reason is that there's a few things going on. It's pretty complicated. If you're really interested in this, I suggest you talk to Luke Tilley, our chief economist. He'll stay here all night talking to you about it. But the first reason is that the bean counters at the Bureau of Labor Statistics don't really know how to measure a lot of the things that are happening in the economy. So for example, you take a paid ride in New York City or anywhere, and they don't know how to, they know that a certain amount of money has been spent on that ride, but they don't know how many rides necessarily occurred. So there's $1 billion of paid rides in New York City, but they don't know how many rides have occurred. Many more rides for that $1 billion than if you were using taxis. So a lot of productivity has occurred, but they don't know how to measure it. So that's one thing that's going on. But there are a lot of other things going on. Let me give you another example. One of the reasons that I use this movie example is because it creates a window to one of the most fascinating things that's happening right now in our economy, which is the creation, essentially, of the streaming economy. Everyone knows about Disney Plus, and one day they signed up 10 million subscribers, which is pretty amazing this week. So think about Netflix. I'll sit home and I'll watch Netflix, and I'll watch my British crime dramas night after night with my wife, and I'll pay $12 a month. Compare that to the value that comes out of paying $60 by going to see a Chipmunk movie, which is what it happened to be, and sleeping through it at the movies. So there's tremendous value that's been created through this new channel of the economy, which we call streaming. And in fact, there's far more value than what I'm actually paying. I'm paying $12 a month, but I'm probably getting $100 or $200 a month of value. That difference I would call it progress. Luke calls it consumer surplus, which is the technical economic term. As new industries are created, there's significantly more value than what is actually monetized in the beginning of that particular industry. So what's happening now is that Disney comes along, and Apple comes along, and Comcast comes along, and they say, wow, look at all that value, I want a piece of that. And they create their own streaming services. Next thing you know, instead of just having all of us on Netflix, how many of you have Netflix accounts? Okay, everybody basically, right? Instead of all of us on Netflix, we're all going to be on 4 or 5 different streaming services. And the economy has grown significantly. So productivity takes a long time to happen in a technological revolution like this, but trust me, it's happening. When we look back at this period, it's our view that this is going to look like a productivity explosion, essentially. We see it happening everywhere. A great example would be self-driving vehicles. So we see a tremendous amount of technology going into automobiles for self-driving. Even electric automobiles would be another example. But the dividends of that haven't paid off yet because it takes a while for those technologies, for those seeds to sprout, and for the technology to actually lead to revenue in the economy. So that's the paradox of productivity, and it's critically important to understand because when we look out listen to Fed Chairman Powell in Congress yesterday, and we saw the same thing with Chairman Yellen, they tell us, well, there's 1 or 2 things that we just don't understand in the economy. We don't understand why there's no inflation. We don't understand why there's not enough wage growth. Well, the reason is that, in our view, is that productivity is there, it's thriving, it's just not being measured. And that has a big bearing on how we decide to invest in the particular economy that we're in. So that's the first idea about productivity. The second idea is what we call the productivity irony. And this is pretty much what we've talked about all evening today, which is that while on the one hand, productivity is a manifestation of all of the great wonders, I think that Gideon called them the wonders of the modern society. For my 10-year-old, it's a keypad where she can order as much popcorn and candy as she wants, have it bring them to her seat at the movies. For us, it's so many other things. But that same technology that leads to efficiency also leads to protectionism. It leads to populism. And that populism leads to protectionism, or it could lead to higher taxes on the fiscal side, depending on whether we're talking about the right or talking about the left. And so that brings us to really the third theme, which is what we call the riddle of productivity. And ultimately, what we have to decide as investors is what is the outcome of all these forces that are working together. So on the one hand, we have the raw efficiency that technology is creating and the investment opportunities that are presented by all these new technologies across most of the sectors of the economy. There's hardly a sector of the economy that's not being deeply transformed by technology in some way. We have the tailwind of unprecedentedly low monetary positioning from the Fed. We've never had an economic cycle like this before, where we've had the foot down on the gas pedal. And you heard Larry talk about it, and I think he's absolutely right, that the Fed has moved pretty significantly this year in order to accelerate the economy. That's a very powerful force to move the economy along. But then on the other hand, you have populism. And we call our capital market forecast this year market tug of war, the interplay between productivity populism and portfolios, because you have this tug of war going on in the world where technology is driving us forward, but then at the same time, there's this disruption. There's this, as Melissa said, period of adaptation, which is the reaction, the political reaction to the displacement of workers in society, the income inequality that we have, et cetera. And so while we're racing forward, we have tremendous policy uncertainty, record levels of policy uncertainty, and we have tariffs that are slowing down business investment and having a real material impact on the economy right now. And so what we're trying to figure out is which one is going to win. And so because this is a year ahead forecast, it's what's going to happen in the next 12 months, I'll give you the answer to the riddle as we see it. And the answer to the riddle as we see it is that productivity is going to win. And the reason that we think productivity is going to win is because we believe that the main risk to the expansion is in fact the protectionism and the tariffs that have been put in place between China and the US and the uncertainty that's come with that. When we examine the dynamics around the negotiations that are occurring between the US and China, we believe that there are a lot of signals and indicators that suggest that it's in both parties' interest right now to agree to a truce. Not necessarily a deal on the merits that's going to impact the China 2025 trajectory in terms of what they want to accomplish with the Belt and Road and become the major dominant hegemony from an economic standpoint. But right now, the U.S. is dealing with an election year, and we believe that if we were to have more tariffs, you'd see basically what I would call an old-fashioned beatdown in the U.S. economy. You'd have a really bad recession if we were to have tariffs. So when Larry says there's less than a 20% chance of having tariffs, of a recession, yeah, we agree completely, assuming that phase one deal gets done and there are no more tariffs on the economy. When I say no more tariffs, I mean no more incremental tariffs relative to where we are today. Okay? On the Chinese side, well, you actually have a significant slowing in the Chinese economy. This Chinese economy is down to probably mid-5% growth this year in terms of the reported numbers. The unreported numbers is considerably lower. So the Chinese economy has been hurt much more than the U.S. economy as a result of the trade war. And the second thing that's going on, which is really fascinating and it shows just how subtle this chess match is between the U.S. and China, is Hong Kong. We have a lot of sources in China, the Chinese nationals and whatnot, help us understand the dynamics of this because it is such an important element in figuring out where markets are going to go. And the Chinese are extremely concerned around the outcome in Hong Kong. Right now, there's a bill pending in the Senate, which is the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Bill. And the administration is very conservatively holding back the progress of that bill because it wants to get a trade agreement done before the Senate acts and before Congress acts. Because what the Chinese do not want to happen is they don't want the U.S. to, in their perception, meddle in the internal affairs of China. They don't want the U.S. to step forward to support the protesters and cause the situation in China to get out of hand. And because that's a real risk for China, if these trade negotiations fall apart, we believe that rather than playing a waiting game, which is what the Chinese have been largely doing, they're going to come to the table and they're going to sign this phase one agreement. I don't know where it's going to be. Maybe it'll be in Larry's office. It'll be somewhere, and it'll get done. And when that happens, it's going to be clear sailing for some number of months. The economy is going to accelerate, and we're going to have a nice period in the markets. And in that environment, interestingly, we've just moved back into international equities. We've moved back into technology. And the reason that we're favoring those asset classes is because, interestingly, non-U.S. developed areas of the world are the ones that are most levered to trade. So even though the trade conflict is between the U.S. and China right now, Germany, Spain, France, the UK, these are the areas of the world that have a much greater proportion of their GDP levered to trade, and those are the areas of the world that will accelerate very quickly. And then technology is very similar as well. So in the technology space, you have tremendous supply chain issues, interwoven connectivity between most countries in the world and China. And so if China is able to reaccelerate itself as a result of the quieting or the quelling of the trade situation, you're going to see a reacceleration. You're going to see a reacceleration in the technology sector, which has already done really well, but that's where all the disruption is coming from. We're still in the early to middle innings, in our view, of this secular disruption that's happening as a result of the technological revolution, the fourth industrial revolution. So I'm going to close by acknowledging the one elephant in the room, if you will, which is the one major risk to our forecast, which we're not positioning for today, but we will start positioning for probably next spring, which is the election. And you've seen a lot of smart people on TV recently that said that if Elizabeth Warren wins, the market's going to be down 25 or 30%. We don't have a view on that yet. We will if we have to. We don't even know who the Democratic candidate is going to be. But clearly, it's going to be a bit of a watershed moment. Coming back to the main theme of the evening, populism, there's clearly this core tension that exists in the country right now around income inequality, who's benefiting from the overall phenomenon of technological revolution. And what we need to keep a very close eye on as investors is how is that gonna play out? Because if it plays out so that we end up with a very different policy agenda in Washington, not just at the White House, but in Congress, or even if it's just the White House, the regulatory environment shifts quite radically for financial companies, for energy companies, for healthcare companies. We're gonna have a very different market to contend with here in the US. So it's very important for investors, but it's a little too early to position. So to summarize, we get the trade thing done with China, we're gonna have clear sailing for 3, 4, 5 months, but we're gonna have to keep a very close eye on what's happening with the political situation as it pertains to the election next year. So with that, hope you've learned a lot about populism and maybe a little bit about productivity tonight. And we welcome you to all to join us for cocktails afterwards. Thank you so much.
Since the night of the T-shirts, I still have one of those in the basement.
Oh, that's weird.
So, bring up some minutes in Michigan, I would say. Shouldn't help them get this.
Midtown New York.